Good morning, and welcome to the 10th lesson in our study of the Book of Esther. This encompasses the last part of chapter 9 and the small chapter 10, so it is the last lesson in the series, and it really sums up what has been said and what has been done in the earlier chapters. On the surface, it's rather straightforward. The Jews have defeated their enemies. Haman and his sons have been executed. Mordecai was now in the king's favor, and so he sent letters to all the Jews, proclaiming that the 14th and 15th day of Adar, the day on which the Jews were to be annihilated, that these days would now be considered to be a festival of joy and of gladness because the Jews had overcome their enemies and had salvaged their existence. So it says in the latter part of chapter 9, that the Jews gathered together in joy in Shushan and in the rest of the provinces, and that Mordecai wrote letters out to all the Jews to tell them, to establish them that they should celebrate these days, the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and of joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So this custom began, and this became known as the Feast of Purim. Pur means lot, and it was the casting of lots that Haman had determined that the 13th and 14th days of Adar would be the day on which the Jews would be annihilated. So this feast commemorates the casting of the lots for those days which the Jews then turned into victory and in days of feast and gladness. So this was the commandment from Esther, from the king, and from Mordecai. And they call these days Purim, the plural of lot, the days commemorating the day in which the Jews salvaged their victory over their enemies. So this really ends the story of Mordecai and Esther on the surface. And this part confirms the authority of Mordecai, the authority of Esther, and the solution that they had for all their problems. In chapter 10 it says this: King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of the Medes and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitudes of his brothers, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. So Mordecai was high in the country, and Queen Esther remained. King Ahasuerus was also called King Xerxes, and it was Esther's stepson, King Ahasuerus' son, that later allowed the Jews under Nehemiah back to rebuild the city and temples of Jerusalem. So this had long, far-reaching repercussions throughout history. So the story of Mordecai and Esther on the surface is a straightforward story of intrigue and of skullduggery between two enemies, Haman and Mordecai. But the implications go much further than this. For instance, as we said before, Haman was the Amalekite, and he was a sworn enemy of the Jews, and this goes back all the way back to Isaac and Esau and Jacob, because if you recall from the earlier times in the book of Genesis, Esau had the birthright literally maneuvered from him, or stolen from him by his brother Jacob, and this set up a long-lasting feud between Esau and Jacob, and between the descendants of Esau and Jacob. Esau's son Esau had a son, and to that son and to a concubine, they had a further son called Amalekite. And this became the father and the earlier part of the generation of Amalekites, who had a consistent and constant feud with the Israelites ever since that day. When the Israelites were leaving Egypt and on their trek across the desert, the Amalekites attacked them without provocation, when they were undefended, when they were unarmed, and it was through God's intervention that the Amalekites were defeated. And it was God's instruction to Saul later on to completely destroy the Amalekites, a feat which Saul refused to do because he spared the life of King Agag and some of their other people. So this was a long-standing feud. So it was against the Amalekites, apparently, that the Jewish people waged their conflict at this time. And it was the Amalekites, not the Persians themselves, but the Amalekites who were ultimately defeated, who were destroyed, and they are no longer heard of anymore in the Bible. God had accomplished his desire before to wipe the Amalekites out. So what we have here are a number of lessons, not necessarily just what you see on the surface, but a number of lessons. A number of lessons against the anti-Semitism which has existed throughout history and exists still today. There are a number of occasions in the past when things have happened which occur earlier in the Bible, which have a great influence on what happens later on in later stories. This is one of them. God made a promise under Saul that he would wipe the Amalekites out because they had done something against the Jewish people which was unprovoked and not called for earlier. This was a long-standing feud. In this book, this commandment or this ordinance of God is carried out. And it shows that people who do things against God's chosen people may themselves be in great jeopardy later on, because he does not forget what he has said, that he would protect his chosen people. The Jews have, with the years, have had a number of occasions when people attempted to destroy their culture and their civilization. Pharaoh tried to do this, and he was shown what God meant at the time of the Passover and the time of the 10th plague. A person by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes tried to do this, and where the problems with Pharaoh ended up with the feast called the Passover, the problems with Antiochus turned out to be the Feast of Hanukkah. Hitler, of course, tried to wipe out the Jewish nation as well during the Second World War, and he did not succeed. And his failure resulted in the establishment again of the Jewish nation of Israel in 1948. And of course, Haman tried to wipe out the Jews as well at the time of Esther, and his defeat became known, later celebrated, as the Feast of Purim. And this is still celebrated today. And it's a feast of joy, it's a feast of celebration when people dress up in costume, people send food to one another, they give gifts to the poor and gifts to each other. And many people, children especially, dressed up as Haman, and then they are defeated by their so-called other children, other enemies. So this is a feast which goes on today throughout the Jewish culture, the Feast of Purim. And this is where it starts, back in the days of Haman and Esther. So it shows in the background that the Jewish people are still favored by God, and that people who have tried to eliminate them have themselves become defeated over the course of many years. What God says, he carries out eventually in times. It also shows the difference between pride and humility. Haman was a prideful man who tried to impose his will upon others. And because one person would not bow down to him, he wanted to defeat the entire Jewish people. This also had to do with his background, but it was also his initial pride at the time, which started the whole ball rolling. It says in Proverbs that pride goes before a fall. Haughtiness leads to one's destruction, and this is the case in Haman's life. Haman himself ended up being executed on the gallows he had hastily built to execute Mordecai. Mordecai stood at the king's gate, did not self-aggrandize himself. He went back to the same position after Haman was actually defeated. After he was favored by the king, he went back to the same position. It was only later that the king elevated him to be prime minister. Haman's humility ended up in his being great. Mordecai's humility ended up in him being great. Haman's pride ended up in him being defeated. The main thing is evident, that God does things behind the scenes much more than we realize, and uses people much more than they realize. This whole story is one of so-called coincidences, or of God-inspired changes which occurred right from the start when King Ahasuerus had his party and asked his queen Ashti to come before him and his compatriots, and she refused, to the time when she was deposed and then a selection was made to choose a second queen. Esther was put forward and she was selected. Esther should have not been a candidate at all, because she was an orphan and had been fathered over by her uncle Mordecai, who was in the king's palace, but it was by chance that she was put forward to be a candidate for queen. And she was selected. She had favor with the king's eunuchs and was coached. She presented herself in a way which King Ahasuerus found favorable, and she was selected. She was in a position to do something which only she could do at the time. And that's why it was said that she was in place for such a time as was then, when the Jews were being threatened by Haman. All these coincidences, all these chances that she had, the fact that she was presented to the king, or presented herself to the king unannounced, with great danger to herself, but was accepted. The fact that she did not give King Ahasuerus what she wanted initially, but asked him to go to a banquet. Then at the first banquet she asked him to go to a second banquet. And between the first and second banquet, the king had problems sleeping, asked for the chronicles to be taken to him, which he read about Mordecai's saving of his life previously by thwarting an attempt and a plot against his kingdom. And then he rewarded Mordecai in a way which caused the disgrace of Haman and Haman's ultimate defeat. All this was too many coincidences to happen just by chance, and it was evident that behind the scenes God was manipulating and doing things to arrange for all this to happen, and ultimately to save his own people. So this is a book which is read very frequently in Jewish synagogues, which is commended because of its great importance in preserving the Jewish race and in the development of the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated today. So this is the story of King Ahasuerus, of Mordecai, and of Esther, and of the great import in the Jewish culture and in the Jewish history and in the Christian history as well, because it all shows how God works at times when we don't expect him to be, when we don't know he is working, and what he can accomplish by doing behind the scenes what he did here. It also shows the problems with pride. And it shows how God does keep his promises and his desires, even though it may take a number of years to do it. But what he says he will do, he does. So this is the story of Esther and Mordecai. I hope it's been enjoyable to you. Join me next week as we start the Book of Galatians, and hopefully we'll get into that in the very near future. Next week we'll start with the introduction, but hope you'll join me for that too. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.